Whenever an aviation accident occurs, we expect that experts will piece together what happened as thoroughly and objectively as possible so that we can learn from it and make sure that a similar accident can never happen again. But what if those experts fundamentally disagree about what actually happened? Stay tuned. In the early morning hours of the 19th of May 2016, air traffic controllers in Athens, Greece, lost contact with an Egyptair Airbus A320 that was cruising at 37,000 feet over the Mediterranean Sea. The aircraft, with 56 passengers and 10 crew members on board, failed to acknowledge a radio handover to Cairo, and only minutes later its transponder signal disappeared from Greek radar screens. Unknown to the controllers though, the plane was still flying at that point, descending towards the sea in a long downward spiral, and it continued to do so for 9 excruciating minutes until it finally crashed into the sea, killing all 66 souls on board. The wreckage then sank to the ocean floor 3,000 meters below, where most of it still remains to this day. Then, for more than 8 years, no final report on the crash was published, and the causes therefore remained a mystery. Until now. And before I can tell you the supposed real story of what took place on board Egyptair Flight 804, we need to understand why there were 2 versions, and for that I need to do something a little bit different this time. Because to explain this, we actually have to start this story on the morning after the disaster. Under Annex 13 of the Chicago Convention on Civil Aviation, the sole right to investigate an aircraft accident lies with the country on whose territory the accident occurred. But when an accident happens far out at sea in international waters, that responsibility instead lies with the aircraft's country of registration. That's why when Egyptair Flight 804 crashed into the Mediterranean on its way from Paris to Cairo, Egypt was automatically made responsible for the investigation. But Annex 13 also obligates the investigation country to invite representatives from the country where the aircraft was manufactured, which in the case of Airbus is France. So as a result of this, on the day of the accident, the French Bureau of Inquiry and Analysis, or BEA, assembled an investigation team consisting of its own experts and engineers from Airbus to go over to Egypt and advise the Egyptian Aircraft Accident Investigation Directorate, or EAAID. For the first month after the crash, the BEA and the Egyptian investigators worked closely together to recover the debris, identify the victims, and extract the contents of the black boxes. But that partnership was then abruptly interrupted when Egyptian experts announced a shocking discovery. One that, in their view, ought to change the course of the entire investigation. You see, they had found traces of highly explosive TNT on several of the victims, and because of this, they claimed that the crash of Egyptair Flight 804 was not an accident at all. Rather, it was a monstrous and unforgivable crime. And based on that evidence, the Egyptian Accident Investigation Directorate and forensic experts appointed by Egypt's Attorney General pieced together the following story, the first version of the events. Egyptair Flight 804 was a regularly scheduled flight operating from Charles de Gaulle Airport in Paris, France, over to Cairo International Airport in Egypt. This red-eye flight had been scheduled to depart Paris late at night and then arrive in Cairo early in the morning, which might have been why the Airbus A320 was somewhat lightly booked, with only 56 passengers on board. The flight featured an unusually large crew of 10 people, including 2 pilots, 5 flight attendants, and 3 security officers whose job was mainly to prevent hijackings. You see, less than 2 months earlier, another Egyptair A320 had been hijacked while en route from Alexandria to Cairo by a man who claimed to be wearing an explosive belt and demanded that the aircraft should be flown to Cyprus instead. Now, no one was hurt in that incident, but the presence of security officers on Flight 804 shows that in the wake of that hijacking, Egyptair considered threats to its aircraft to be a very real possibility. The pilot in command on this night was a 36-year-old captain who had been flying for Egyptair for 3 years and had about 6,600 total hours, including 2,100 on the Airbus A320. The first officer was 25 years old and had actually joined Egyptair at the minimum age of 20 back in 2011, where he had been first trained to fly on the Airbus A320 and then joined the regular line in 2012. On this morning, he had accumulated a total of 2,966 hours, of which essentially all had been flown on the Airbus A320. Before the flight, the pilots would have reviewed the dispatch documents, including the weather information and the technical log, and the weather along the route was basically fine, with only scattered clouds all the way over to Cairo, so they would have likely expected a fairly smooth flight. The aircraft technical log showed that there had been several minor defects with various lights and valves over the last 6 days, but they had mostly been resolved, and there was nothing new in there that would affect their upcoming flight. But after the accident, there were unverified media reports about a large number of fault messages registered during the previous few flights that hadn't been entered into the technical log. But of course, the final report obviously only shows what was actually written down, so if the previous pilots hadn't been reporting those defects, well then obviously they wouldn't be in the tech log, so it's unclear if the logbook fully covered the whole story here. And while we're on the subject of logs, did you know that most of what you share online, including your email addresses, mailing address, and even info about your family and friends, is being logged, packaged, and sold by companies known as data brokers? Well, it is, and they can do that completely legally. This is why you're getting so much spam and robocalls nowadays, and I personally find that absurd. But you can actually ask them to stop. You just have to find them all, and to do so individually. And there are hundreds, if not thousands, of them out there. This is where today's sponsor, Incogni, comes in, because Incogni takes on this fight for you and sends out its digital army to start removing your data from the web as soon as you signed up for them. And they will then also continue doing this for as long as you stay with them. When I signed up, I was shocked to discover just how much of my data was floating around out there, and Incogni has already requested its removal from well over 100 different brokers, which means way less spam for me. So if you're interested in trying this out, Incogni makes this all really easy and affordable, especially if you use my link here below, which is incogni.com/pilot. If you use that and the code PILOT, you will get an exclusive 60% discount, which is awesome. Thank you, Incogni. Now, let's continue. The loading process and pre-flight checks were uneventful, and after starting the engines and taxiing to the runway, Flight 804 received takeoff clearance at time 21:21 UTC. The crew then pushed the thrust levers forward and accelerated down the runway before climbing away into the dark night. The pilots were soon authorized to climb to their planned cruising altitude of flight level 370, or 37,000 feet, and the flight subsequently crossed Switzerland and Italy without incident before proceeding down the Adriatic coast towards Greece. During this part of the flight, the cockpit voice recorder captured a quite relaxed atmosphere as the pilots chatted away and listened to some music in the background. However, around this time, the cabin crew also reported that a passenger had started feeling unwell. So, for the first half of the 2-hour-long CBR recording, flight attendants were regularly coming into the cockpit to provide updates on the passenger's condition while the flight crew discussed what they would do. They may have briefly discussed the possibility of a diversion if the medical condition of the passenger got worse, but in the end they ended up sticking to their original flight plan. A little bit later, the pilots then had a meal delivered. Lasagna apparently, and a while after that, a flight attendant came back into the cockpit again to check on them. The captain then told her that he was feeling a little bit cold and asked for a blanket and a pillow, so the flight attendant retrieved those items and soon delivered them back to the cockpit. One of the pilots then offered her to sit down on the jump seat, but then, suddenly, at approximately time 00:25 and 24 seconds, an explosive device detonated without warning inside one of the catering carts in the forward galley on the right side of the aircraft, just behind the cockpit. The explosion wasn't powerful enough to cause an immediate breakup of the aircraft, but it did cause severe damage to the galley and forward cabin, as well as to some nearby systems, including the crew oxygen system, which supplies oxygen up to the pilots during a possible emergency. The explosion also ignited several objects and surfaces in the galley area, sparking a fire that was then accelerated by a breach somewhere in the crew oxygen system, creating a fast-spreading blaze. Within seconds, the crew saw that fire and asked for a fire extinguisher, but the fire was already spreading way too quickly and was therefore soon out of control. As this was happening, several system faults were recorded in quick succession, which were transmitted to Egyptair via the Aircraft Communication Addressing and Reporting System, or ACARS. This is a system which automatically sends fault reports to company computers on the ground in order to give mechanics a head start on resolving any issues that might arise in flight. 44 seconds after the explosion, Egyptair headquarters therefore received an ACARS message indicating that smoke had been detected in one of the lavatories. This was then followed by a fault with the right-hand window anti-ice system, a right-hand sliding window sensor fault, smoke in the avionics bay, a fault with the number 2 flight control unit, and finally a fault with the number 3 spoiler elevator computer. And those two last items are both critical components of the Airbus's fly-by-wire system. The flight data recorder then also captured a cascade of additional faults and failures, including the traffic collision avoidance system, the rudder pedal force sensors, spoiler elevator computer number 2, the smoke detection control unit, the number 2 flight augmentation computer, the weather radar, the number 2 flight management guidance computer, and the number 2 electronic engine control computer, as well as several other systems as well. And most of those systems all failed during a period of just 19 seconds. So by the time 0029 and 29 seconds, these failures had caused the automatic disconnection of the autopilot. But curiously, there seemed to be no response from the crew, and therefore no one took control of the aircraft. Moments later, at approximately time 0029 and 45 seconds, the flight data recorder ceased recording while the aircraft was still at 37,000 feet. And the cockpit voice recorder then stopped about 9 seconds later. The last recorded data showed the aircraft still maintaining altitude while making a shallow left turn followed by a turn back to the right, at which point the recorder stopped working. Egyptian investigators concluded that the explosion, fire and smoke rapidly incapacitated the flight crew, causing the flight path to become uncontrolled after the system failures had disconnected the autopilot. The transponder then failed at around the same time as the recorders did, causing the flight to disappear from the controller's radar screens in both Athens and Cairo. And that obviously triggered the controllers to repeatedly try to contact the aircraft, but with no reply. But the aircraft continued to be visible on primary radar, which works by bouncing signals directly off objects in the sky. And while air traffic controllers normally rely on secondary radar, which uses the aircraft's own transponder in order to learn its identity, altitude and speed, primary radar, on the other hand, only shows a target with no further information attached. So in this case, primary radar continued to track how the aircraft embarked on a right-hand spiral, performing several steadily tightening orbits before it finally disappeared at time 0038 and 50 seconds. Just over 9 minutes after the end of the black box recordings. Subsequently, rescuers detected a signal from the plane's emergency locator transmitter, or ELT, which is a radio transmitter designed to emit a signal indicating the location of the aircraft when the device is subjected to a forward deceleration greater than 2 Gs, indicating a potential crash. But in this case, analysis of the radar track soon showed that the ELT actually went off while the plane was still in the air, nearly 2 minutes before it hit the water. Egyptian investigators believe that the device must have experienced a deceleration greater than 2 Gs in order to have activated. But since the aircraft didn't crash for another 2 minutes, the ELT might have therefore been activated by a secondary explosion on board the aircraft. In its final report, the EAID stated that because TNT was found on the victims and because that material is not used anywhere in the aircraft, its presence could only be explained by a detonation of an explosive device inside of the plane. And the EAID also argued that this explosion must have occurred in the forward galley based on several factors. First of all, they pointed to the fact that the lavatory smoke detector was triggered before the avionics-based smoke detector that's located underneath the cockpit. In their view, the order of the warnings meant that the fire and smoke originated closer to the lavatory than to the cockpit. And apart from that, recovered wreckage from the forward right side of the aircraft as well as the business class cabin showed signs of exposure to fire, such as sooting and charring, while recovered portions of the fuselage skin in this area was curled outwards. A forensic report produced by a team assembled by the Egyptian Attorney General also described fragments of structure embedded into human remains, supposedly due to an explosion. Their report concluded that severe crushing and folding of 2 catering trolleys recovered from the ocean floor also indicated that they must have been exposed to a powerful explosion. And a hissing sound that was heard on the cockpit voice recorder at the time of the explosion then led the EAID to conclude that the effects of the explosion were likely worsened by damage to the crew oxygen system, which caused an oxygen leak that accelerated the resulting fire. The explosion and the fire then caused so many aircraft systems to fail because they damaged an electrical panel in the right rear part of the cockpit, to which nearly all of the affected systems were connected. These system failures then led to the disconnection of the autopilot, causing the flight path to become uncontrollable since the flight crew had been killed or incapacitated by the fire and smoke. The Egyptian team also added that there were no evidence of problems with any aircraft systems prior to the explosion that would otherwise explain the scenario. So let's pause right here. This is certainly a plausible explanation of this accident, but is it what really happened? You see, as it turns out, both the French investigators from the BEA and experts that my team and I have been speaking to believe that there are some serious problems with the scenario described by the Egyptian investigators. In fact, in its comments on the final report, the BEA included a stunning accusation, writing that the factual accuracy of the report is questionable and the reasoning for the scenarios appears to distort the facts. Now that is something that I have never seen before in an accident report. So what exactly did the BEA take issue with? What was wrong with the Egyptian scenario? Well, there are a lot of ways to go about it, but let's start with the evidence that was used. When air crash investigators believe that a bomb might have brought down an aircraft, there are several ways to prove this to be the fact. In high-profile bombings or attacks like the Lockerbie disaster or Malaysia Airlines Flight 17, investigators reassembled the wreckage in order to map out how the explosion ripped through the aircraft and also to look for telltale signs like impacts from high-energy fragments or micro-pitting of nearby surfaces. In some of those cases, investigators also detected residue from the explosives used in the attacks, but those residues were then only one component of the evidence. However, as the BEA points out in its comments, the explosive residue supposedly found on some of the victims in this case was the only real evidence that the EAID had of an intentional explosion. Very little wreckage was recovered from the Mediterranean seafloor, including almost none of the aircraft's structure, so it wasn't possible to reassemble it and look for patterns of explosion damage. Damage to pieces of fuselage skin, like outward curling, doesn't mean anything unless those pieces are properly reassembled, because wreckage can get crumbled in all kinds of ways during a crash, and only the full pattern then tells you anything meaningful. And on top of this, the forensic reports didn't describe any high-energy impacts or micro-pitting found. But most importantly, the cockpit voice recording completely lacked the telltale sounds associated with an explosion. Instead, the first abnormal sound on the tape was actually the hissing sound of oxygen escaping from the crew oxygen system, and there was no sound that could be interpreted as an explosion at all. If an explosion had actually breached the fuselage and caused the skin to curl outward, well then the aircraft would have immediately lost pressurization, triggering a cabin altitude warning which has a very distinctive sound. But the cockpit voice recorder kept going for 4.5 minutes after the time of the alleged explosion, and yet there was no cabin altitude warning on it, which strongly suggests that the airplane was still pressurized at that time. And of course, if the plane was brought down by a bomb, one would hope that Egypt would find the person who did it and bring them to justice. But 8.5 years after the crash, no one has claimed responsibility for it, no suspects have been named, nor has anybody been arrested, tried or convicted, which would be highly unusual. In fact, the Egyptian report also didn't say a word about how the bomb was placed on board the aircraft or who might have been responsible for putting it there. As a result of these factors, the BEA and our own expert contacts largely agree that the Egyptian report was written with the assumption that the TNT found on the victims had to have come from an explosive device. And the rest of the report was then spent trying to make the evidence fit into that theory, which is the exact opposite of how an accident investigation should be conducted. In comments to the media, the BEA also indicated that the presence of TNT was actually in doubt, because since the bodies had been underwater for so long, any TNT residue would have been dissolved. So, if a bomb didn't bring down Flight 804, then what did? Well, first of all, it's important to mention that when the traces of TNT were found on the victims, the Egyptian government deemed the crash a criminal matter, and the investigation then was largely taken away from the EAID and assigned to the Attorney General's office instead. But at that point, the French BEA had already been given access to the flight recorders, and they believed that the evidence instead pointed to a catastrophic fire on board rather than an explosion. As a result, the BEA requested the EAID to support a study to possible ignition sources and propagation methods, only to be told by the Egyptian investigators that the matter was now out of their hands. This prompted the BEA to independently conduct testing of several fire scenarios, which, in combination with the flight data, led them to develop a completely different explanation for what actually happened on board Flight 804. And what they found was, well, to put it simply, pretty scary. Now, to understand the BEA's proposed accident scenario, we first need to take a close look at the crew oxygen system on board the Airbus A320. Every pressurized aircraft is equipped with supplemental oxygen in order to help the passengers and crew breathe in the event of a depressurization at high altitude. But while the passengers' oxygen masks drop from the ceiling and supply only about 12 minutes of air through an oxygen generating system, the flight crew has access to a much more sophisticated system. The flight crew oxygen on the Airbus A320 comes from a cylinder located underneath the forward left side of the aircraft, and that canister supplies several hours of oxygen to 4 full-face oxygen masks located at each cockpit seating position. Those masks are designed to be put on with one swift motion so as not to encumber the pilots during an emergency. And all the pilot has to do is to open the cover on the mask stowage box and then pull the mask out using the bright red handle. The pilot can then put the mask on and start breathing without pressing any buttons or doing anything else at all. So how does that system actually work then? Well, when the oxygen leaves the cylinder, it flows up through a series of steel tubes and into a distribution manifold. It then continues through flexible tubing to each mask storage box, and at the point where the tube enters the box, a valve prevents the oxygen from traveling the rest of the way up to the mask. But when the pilots pull the handle to lift the mask out of the box, the 2 clamshell-style box doors open, and it's actually that movement that energizes a solenoid which opens the valve. When the valve is open, the oxygen mask built-in microphone also activates in order to transmit the pilot's speech to the cockpit loudspeakers, the cockpit voice recorder, and to allow the use of the radio through the mask. And when the pilots have the masks on, oxygen can be delivered in 3 different ways, depending on the settings used. Using the regulator switch, the pilot can choose either normal, which mixes oxygen with the ambient air, or the 100% setting, which supplies only pure oxygen. In either of those cases, the oxygen flow is on demand, which means oxygen only flows when the pilot inhales. But in the event of heavy smoke in the cockpit, it's better to have a continuous flow of oxygen in order to create a positive pressure inside of the mask, preventing smoke from entering. So in that case, the pilot can move an emergency knob to the emergency position, which will cause oxygen to flow from the mask at a continuous pressure of 5 bar. Now, pressing this knob inward will also cause oxygen to flow at positive pressure, but only for as long as the knob is kept depressed, and only when the valve is already open. On the box itself, there is also a button labeled Press to Test and Reset, which causes the valve to open while depressed, but it is important to note that this doesn't cause oxygen to flow, because there's neither positive pressure nor any breathing action by the pilot. Now, of course, if these masks would malfunction for some reason, that could be a huge possible problem. So a quick test of the oxygen masks forms part of the pilot's normal pre-flight procedure. To do that test, the crew should first verify that the oxygen system is on, check that the loudspeakers are also on, and then press and hold the test button to open the valve. Then the emergency knob should be pressed in order to cause oxygen to flow at positive pressure through the open valve, while listening to the loudspeakers to confirm that the mask microphone is picking up that flow. Now, after a couple of seconds, this should be confirmed, at which point the pilot can release the emergency knob and the test button to stop oxygen flow and then to close the valve. And after that, the pilot should then press the emergency knob one more time to verify that the valve is properly closed. And if it is, well, then there should be no sound of oxygen flowing. This test confirms not only that the oxygen flows when it's supposed to, but also that oxygen doesn't flow when it's not supposed to. Which brings us to another topic that we need to talk about, which is oxygen system safety. You see, the biggest risk with any oxygen system is definitely fire. And that's because a fire needs 3 things in order to burn: fuel, heat, and oxygen. And very importantly for this story, the more oxygen that is present, the less heat is required to ignite the available fuel. That means that any sort of ignition source inside the oxygen system is a potentially enormous safety hazard, because the 100% oxygen atmosphere inside of the system allows basically anything to catch fire when heated. For that exact reason, oxygen supply systems on aircraft are subject to very strict regulations, requiring manufacturers to demonstrate that any failure or probable combination of failures resulting in an oxygen fuel fire are extremely remote. Now, in aviation certification language, extremely remote generally means that a probability of such an occurrence is between 1 in 100 million and 1 in a billion per flight hour. Now, due to the existence of unknown unknowns, meaning that we can't really protect against things that we don't know, that's about as improbable as we can practically make systems with our current science and technology. But for most common aircraft types and systems, with thousands of planes out there racking up hours day in and day out, it's far from inconceivable that something with a 1 in a billion chance of happening will eventually still happen. Murphy's Law, in other words. And in fact, there have been several incidents in the last 20 years involving oxygen fires in the cockpit, but crucially, always while the plane was still on the ground. For instance, back in 2009, a CRJ-200 was badly damaged in Florida when a junction box caught fire and breached an oxygen line in the cockpit. Then, in 2011, an Egyptair Boeing 777 was written off after an oxygen leak from the first officer's mask caught fire due to unknown reasons, shortly after boarding. But all of the passengers were safely evacuated, luckily. Then in 2008, a cargo Boeing 767 was written off in San Francisco when a short circuit energized a spring inside of a hose supplying oxygen to a mask in the supernumerary crew area, causing a fire. And that one is worth remembering. But perhaps the most bizarre incident happened in 2012 when a Boeing 737 was badly damaged during pushback from a gate in Antalya, Turkey, due to an oxygen-fueled fire in the cockpit caused by a captain's perfume. In that case, oxygen was already flowing from the captain's mask, where the knob had been left in the emergency position, and the captain then apparently lit a cigarette which ignited some heavily laden cologne, causing a fire. And in this case, the pilots reported that they saw a ball of sparks flying through the air towards the captain's oxygen mask, then spreading the fire, and the captain pulled the mask out of the box to try and stop the oxygen flow, but it was then already too late. The pilots attempted to extinguish the fire, but failed, and the aircraft was then again successfully evacuated. Now, the most important takeaways from all of these incidents is that none of them were caused by the same ignition mechanism, and some of the mechanisms were pretty weird. It's also worth noting that they all involve different aircraft types with different oxygen system configurations. So what this really testifies to is the inherent difficulty in designing a system that supplies a key ingredient in the fire triangle without also causing risks. But the fact that nobody was killed or seriously hurt in any of these incidents over billions of flight hours also highlights just how safe these systems actually are. Yet the fact remains that if any of those incidents had happened while the plane was in flight, the outcome could have been very different. And that's not only because an oxygen-fueled fire in the cockpit would spread rapidly and incapacitate the crew, it's also because it's not that easy to put it out using the equipment currently on board the aircraft. During its investigation, the BEA discovered that the halon fire extinguishers stored in aircraft cockpits not only wouldn't put out an oxygen-fueled fire, but they could actually make the situation worse. And that's because halon has no cooling effect. Rather, it combines chemically with the oxygen in the air in order to smother the fire or stop the chemical reaction. But since an oxygen leak keeps adding more oxygen, the fire will just then reignite when the cloud of halon clears and the oxygen gets in contact with the still hot fuel again. And if that's not bad enough, the BEA tests show that using a halon extinguisher on an oxygen fire in a confined space creates dense smoke filled with toxic chemicals. So, what does all of this have to do with Egyptair Flight 804 then? Well, let's take a look at some of the reasons why the BEA believes that an oxygen fire actually caused this crash and not a bomb. The biggest clue pointing in that direction was that the very first abnormal sound on the cockpit voice recording wasn't an explosion, but rather a hissing sound like gas leaking. Not only that, but an audio spectrum analysis showed that the first officer's oxygen mask microphone had been active for at least 30 minutes before the event, and probably for the entire 2-hour recording, and even longer than that. The only way for the mask microphone to be active was if the valve was already open, which could be because the press to test button was stuck or because of the box doors not being properly closed. The entire mask box had been replaced just 10 flights before the accident after a pilot had reported that the press to test button was stuck, but it's more likely that the valve in this case reopened later during this or maybe the previous flight for some reason. Anyway, with the valve open, oxygen still wouldn't have flowed from the mask because there was no pressure differential to propel it, so this would have constituted a latent condition. But with the mask mic active, sounds of objects moving near the active masks, like papers or books in the nearby document storage compartment, would have been picked up and broadcasted over the pilot's loudspeakers, as long as they weren't using their headsets, which in cruise they likely wouldn't be. Now, because the pilots were listening to music and engaged in continuous conversation, they might not have noticed those sounds from the document compartment at first. That is, until just before the start of the accident event, when the conversation trailed off a little bit and the music entered a quiet stretch. During that period, the mask microphone picked up some muffled sounds like objects moving in the document storage compartment, and since the music was now quiet and the conversation had stopped, the first officer might have actually heard them over the speaker for the first time. Now, it is important to note here that neither pilot said anything that would indicate that they heard these sounds or associated them with the mask microphone, but if the first officer did, it would possibly explain what happened next. Because referring to the familiar pre-flight test procedure, he might have decided to press the emergency knob to test whether the sounds were coming from his mask. And if so, he might not have verbalized this intention to the captain, because the captain was trying to rest. After all, he had just ordered a blanket and a pillow. So at time 0025 and 24 seconds, the cockpit voice recorder captured a hissing sound lasting 2.6 seconds, similar to the sound of oxygen flowing through an open valve with the emergency knob depressed, just like that pre-flight test. Now this sound was heard clearly on the first officer's CVR channel, but only faintly on the other channels, which proves that the sound came from the first officer's side. After those 2.6 seconds, the hissing sound briefly stopped, and the captain said an unidentified word, maybe inquiring what the first officer was doing. But then, suddenly, the CVR recorded a loud popping sound, again recorded clearly on the first officer's channel, but only faintly on the others. The BEA believed that this was the sound of some type of mechanical failure inside of the first officer's oxygen mask box, which was probably connected in some way to the first officer pressing down the emergency knob. Now, despite extensive testing of various ignition scenarios, from cigarettes and battery fires to particle impacts inside of the hose, the BEA team wasn't able to exactly determine what took place at that moment. And it should also be noted here that despite media reports claiming that the pilots were smoking in the cockpit and that a cigarette had therefore ignited the oxygen, the BA actually refuted this in its report. The phrase from the CVR that the media at the time thought indicated smoking was actually a faulty translation of a discussion around the sick passenger. So instead, a short circuit most likely occurred, similar to the previous incident that I mentioned where a short circuit had energized a spring which ignited a fire inside of the oxygen hose. And that particular problem was fixed after that accident, but as we saw earlier, there are many possible ignition scenarios and no two incidents are exactly the same. And also, if information from a parallel French judicial probe is to be believed, then this aircraft may have been experiencing numerous faults that suggested an electrical problem, which further supports the short circuit theory. But the BA didn't have access to any of that information during their investigation. In any case, no matter what happened inside of that box on Egyptair Flight 804, its effects were immediate and catastrophic. Right after that pop, the hissing sound returned, but this time it kept ramping up and up and up in what's known as a sound runaway, indicating an uncontrolled oxygen leak. And simultaneously with this oxygen leak, a fire also ignited inside of the box, probably due to that same initiating event, since there was no evidence that a fire had already been burning at that stage. Now, BEA tests demonstrated that once a fire started inside the box in the presence of a 5-bar oxygen leak, the pressurized oxygen would cause a blow-torching effect, blasting extremely hot flames against all nearby systems and structural elements. And this blow-torching also produces a characteristic sound that was clearly heard on the CVR. The ensuing fire must have been immediate and large, because within 2 seconds of the start of the leak, the first officer started shouting, "Fire! Fire!" Both the flight attendant on the jump seat and the captain then also shouted out "Fire!" in a shocked manner. Within 6 seconds, the captain called out, "Extinguisher! Extinguisher quickly! Bring fire extinguisher quickly!" showing that he had definitely recognized the potentially catastrophic situation. But by now, the fire was probably already blow-torching against the aft right side of the cockpit, which unfortunately also was where the Halon fire extinguisher was mounted, so it was probably already inaccessible. Someone must have now also opened the cockpit door, because the captain shouted out, "Close it!" And at this point, it's likely that the first officer would have also left his seat due to the heat of the flames, but it's not known how many people remained in the cockpit, nor who opened the door or why. In any case, someone did close the door, but by then, smoke had already escaped from the cockpit and reached the galley and forward lavatories, causing the lavatory smoke alarm to go off. And that triggered a master caution warning, as well as several oral alarms in both the cockpit and the galley. Now, the intensity of that galley alarm was used by the BEA to determine when the cockpit door was open versus closed, and at the time of the first alarm, it was definitely closed. However, no one responded to the alarm, nor were there any signs of life in the cockpit at that point. By now, the first officer's microphone had already been lost from the CVR recording as the fire consumed that part of the cockpit, and the quality of the recording only continued to deteriorate from there. Still, it was possible to hear the galley alarm repeating a sequence of 3 chimes every 30 seconds, and by the time the second sequence came around, someone had apparently opened the cockpit door because it was heard much more clearly. However, there were still no clearly identifiable sounds of any activity in the cockpit, nor any sounds of the fire extinguisher being released, so what was happening here will never be fully known. But what we do know is that multiple systems were now already failing as the fire blasted against the 120 VU electrical panel situated behind the first officer's seat. When the galley alarm went off again at 00:27 and 18 seconds, 110 seconds after the start of the event, the cockpit door was still open, but by time 27:48 seconds, someone had evidently closed it again. During those 30 seconds, Athens area controller twice instructed Flight 804 to contact Cairo on a frequency of 124.7, but there was no reply from the crew. 46 seconds after the lavatory smoke alarm, an avionics smoke warning was also generated as smoke began to seep down through the vents of the cockpit floor into the avionics bay. What was now going on in the cockpit is highly uncertain, but the CVR transcript does show rather remarkably that 2.5 minutes after the start of the fire, someone was still in or had now re-entered the cockpit because the captain's microphone picked up some weak breathing sounds. The sound of a falling object was also heard, followed by a person uttering the words, "Ask forgiveness of God," likely a pilot's final prayer in the face of the unthinkable. Around 3 minutes and 23 seconds after the start of the fire, the sound of the oxygen leak started to die away, indicating that the crew oxygen cylinder had now been depleted. But by that time, the fire was already well established and it was now too late to stop it. And the systems were still failing, one after another. The sound of breathing was last heard at time 00:28 and 42 seconds, but the background music bizarrely continued to play, punctuated by periodic calls from air traffic control that all went unanswered. Another Egyptair aircraft who was listening to the radio conversation even called for the first officer by name, trying unsuccessfully to reach his friend and colleague. Now, we don't know whether the first officer had fled and was in the cabin at this point or if he was incapacitated in the cockpit, and we will sadly never find that out. At time 00:29 and 39 seconds, the system failures finally caused the autopilot to disconnect, triggering a cavalry charge alarm. But no one took control of the plane, and the cockpit voice recorder ended 6 seconds later with the aircraft still maintaining 37,000 feet. After that, we don't know whether any crew members were still alive or able-bodied, or whether they might try to re-enter the cockpit to fight the fire, but whatever efforts that they might have undertaken must have been ultimately unsuccessful. Because the plane now soon entered into what's known as a graveyard spiral, descending in series of tighter and tighter orbits towards the ocean. The fire most likely continued to grow during that 9 minutes descent because the emergency locator transmitter, ELT, probably activated early due to a short circuit when the fire damaged the wiring for the associated switch in the cockpit. On top of that, pieces of the business class cabin was later found with significant fire and smoke damage, indicating that at some point the fire must have spread out of the cockpit and into the passenger cabin. And I don't even want to think about the panic that this must have caused before they impacted the water. In 2023, the French BA assembled its findings, and it outlined the story of what happened in a report that was submitted to the Egyptian Aircraft Accident Investigation Department for consideration, urging them to publish a final report in order to advance aviation safety. Then, in October of 2024, the EAAID also finally did so, publishing its own report endorsing the bomb theory, but also including the French report unchanged as an attachment. Now, I'm not going to speculate why Egypt stuck with the bomb theory or where the alleged traces of TNT came from. We just don't know the answer to those questions. But what I can say is that the French report appears to describe a more credible account of what actually happened. And not only that, the BAA report also reveals a potentially serious safety issue that went unaddressed for 8 years because of the failure to conduct and release a proper investigation. An oxygen system failure resulting in a cockpit fire with nothing that the crew could do to stop it is beyond the nightmare scenario for me as a pilot. And the BAA was clearly well aware of the urgency to do something about it. In their recommendations, they urged EASA, Airbus and the oxygen system manufacturer to test several specific scenarios that they themselves hadn't been able to check, including a system overpressure and some other ignition scenarios, not only for general safety purposes, but also in order to gain a better understanding of what ultimately brought down Flight 804. The BAA also recommended that new firefighting methods should be developed to help flight crews fight and extinguish cockpit oxygen fires. Now, even as I say this, the story of Egyptair Flight 804 still isn't over, and it won't be over until concrete steps are taken to make oxygen systems safer. But what I want to emphasize is that despite only having access to the data the Egyptians gave them, and without the resources or authority to conduct a full investigation or recover the wreckage, the BAA decided on its own to keep studying this cause. That pursuit of truth demonstrated real professionalism and dedication to the cause of aviation safety, and should really be properly commended. Thanks to their work, the industry will now hopefully get to the bottom of this, and that will very likely create changes to reduce the chances of a cockpit oxygen fire and to ensure that crew members can put one out if it happens. So, as scary as this accident was, I am personally confident that we're already learning from it, just as the aviation industry always does. Now, I hope that you have learned something, and if you have, consider supporting our work for safer aviation by joining our Patreon crew. Thank you so much for watching. Watch these videos next and have an absolutely fantastic day. Bye-bye.